She smells like the past. Those words hit me like ice water on a summer morning, whispered by my own daughter-in-law as she passed behind my chair at my grandson's birthday party in our cramped Brooklyn apartment. I pretended not to hear, but my hands trembled as I held my lukewarm coffee. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and at 73 years old, I thought I had seen everything life could throw at me, but nothing prepared me for the slow, suffocating realization that the family I had sacrificed everything for had turned me into their personal ATM and emotional punching bag. The morning those cruel words were spoken, I woke up at 5:30 as usual in my tiny room at the back of what used to be my own apartment. The familiar sounds of Brooklyn stirred outside my cracked window. The distant rumble of the subway, the hiss of hydraulic brakes from the city buses, the voices of early commuters hurrying to catch the train. I could smell the stale coffee from the kitchen, but I knew better than to venture there uninvited. That kitchen, where I had once prepared thousands of meals with love and care, had become foreign territory. My son Marcus and his wife Jessica had made it clear through their cold stares and dismissive gestures that I was no longer the matriarch of this household. I was merely a tenant in my own home, paying rent through my social security check and whatever small jobs I could still manage at my age. The apartment itself told the story of my diminished status. Once filled with my furniture, my photographs, my memories carefully arranged on every surface, it now reflected Jessica's taste entirely. Clean lines, neutral colors, and not a single trace of the woman who had raised a family within these walls for over 40 years. My belongings had been systematically relocated to my small room, as if my entire life could be contained in a space barely larger than a walk-in closet. That morning, as I sat on the edge of my narrow bed listening to the sounds of my family preparing for the day without me, I fingered the worn fabric of my late husband's scarf. Robert had been gone for 12 years now, but I still kept that scarf folded carefully in my dresser drawer. Sometimes I would press it to my face and imagine I could still smell his aftershave, that comforting blend of sandalwood and safety that had once made even our darkest days bearable. But even that comfort was fading. Just like everything else in my life seemed to be disappearing one painful piece at a time. The birthday party was supposed to be a celebration. My grandson Tyler was turning 8, and for weeks I had been looking forward to seeing his face light up when he opened the present I had carefully saved for. I had worked extra hours cleaning the office building downtown, mopping floors and emptying trash cans until my arthritis screamed in protest, just to afford the superhero action figure he had been wanting. Every dollar I earned felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, but the thought of Tyler's smile made it all worthwhile. But as the guests began to arrive that afternoon, I realized with growing horror that I was not celebrated as the loving grandmother who had helped raise this child. I was tolerated, at best. The other parents barely acknowledged my presence. And when they did speak to me, their voices carried that particular tone people use with the elderly, loud, slow, and slightly condescending, as if age had somehow damaged my ability to understand simple conversation. Jessica flitted around the apartment like a butterfly, gracious and charming with everyone except me. She had transformed our living room into a picture-perfect party scene, complete with themed decorations and a professionally made cake that must have cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Every detail was Instagram-ready. Every moment carefully curated to project the image of a perfect family celebration. But I was not part of that image. I watched from my chair in the corner as she posed for photos with Tyler, her smile radiant and maternal. Marcus stood beside them, his arm around his wife's waist, looking every inch the proud father and devoted husband. They looked so complete, so happy, so absolutely content in their bubble of prosperity and success. And then Jessica's eyes met mine across the room, and for just a moment, her mask slipped. The look she gave me was pure disdain, the kind of expression you might reserve for something unpleasant you had stepped in on the sidewalk. That's when she leaned over to whisper to her friend Sarah, who had been admiring the party decorations. I couldn't hear the words at first, but something about Jessica's posture and the way Sarah suddenly glanced in my direction made my blood run cold. They were talking about me. The grandmother who had changed Tyler's diapers when Jessica was too tired, who had walked the floors with him during those endless colicky nights, who had sung him lullabies in the same voice that had once soothed his father to sleep. And then I heard it, crystal clear as Jessica moved closer to where I was sitting. "She smells like the past," she whispered to Sarah, just loud enough for me to catch every syllable. "You know how old people get. All those musty clothes and that weird perfume they wear. I keep telling Marcus we need to do something about it, but he's too soft-hearted." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my face flush hot with shame and embarrassment, even though I knew I was freshly bathed and wearing a clean dress that I had pressed carefully that morning. The perfume she was referring to was a light floral scent I had worn for decades, the same one Robert had complimented me on during our courtship. But apparently, in Jessica's world, everything about me had become obsolete, including the way I smelled. I sat frozen in my chair, trying to process what I had just heard. This was my daughter-in-law, the woman I had welcomed into our family with open arms when Marcus first brought her home 10 years ago. I had overlooked her little criticisms and subtle put-downs, attributing them to the natural adjustment period that comes with marriage and blended families. I had defended her to my friends when they suggested she was too demanding, too controlling, too quick to exclude me from family decisions. But there was no defending this. There was no way to interpret "she smells like the past" as anything other than pure, calculated cruelty. The worst part was the casual way she had said it, as if discussing me like an unpleasant household problem was the most natural thing in the world. As if I wasn't sitting just 10 feet away. As if I couldn't hear. As if my feelings didn't matter at all. The rest of the party passed in a haze of forced smiles and swallowed tears. I watched Tyler blow out his candles and tear through his presents with the enthusiasm only an 8-year-old can muster. My carefully chosen gift was opened along with all the others, but it got lost in the pile of expensive toys and gadgets that made my action figure look pathetic by comparison. Tyler said thank you politely, the way children do when adults are watching, but I could see that my present held no special significance for him. It was just another toy in the pile, indistinguishable from all the rest. When the party finally ended and the guests began to leave, I retreated to my room and closed the door. The sounds of cleanup drifted through the thin walls, Jessica directing Marcus on how to fold the tables, where to store the leftover decorations, what needed to be thrown away and what could be saved for next time. But no one asked if I needed help carrying dishes to the kitchen. No one thanked me for whatever small contributions I had made to the day. No one even seemed to notice that I had disappeared. I sat on my bed in the gathering darkness, still wearing my party dress, but feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. The apartment around me buzzed with the warm afterglow of a successful celebration, but I might as well have been invisible. Or worse than invisible. I was a presence they actively wished would disappear, a reminder of a past they wanted to forget, an inconvenience they tolerated only because some small vestige of family loyalty prevented them from throwing me out entirely. Have you ever felt like that? Like you've somehow become a burden to the very people you love most in the world? If you have, then you understand the particular kind of pain that settled into my chest that night. It wasn't the sharp, clean pain of a physical injury that you know will heal with time. It was the deep, aching pain of rejection, the kind that makes you question everything you thought you knew about yourself and your place in the world. As I undressed and prepared for bed, I caught sight of myself in the small mirror above my dresser. The woman looking back at me seemed smaller than I remembered, more fragile, with lines around her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too many tears shed in private. My hair, once thick and lustrous, had thinned to the point where my scalp showed through in places. My hands, once steady and capable, now showed the telltale tremor of age and stress. Was this what Jessica saw when she looked at me? Was this why she found my very presence so offensive? I pulled Robert's scarf from the dresser drawer and held it close to my face, searching for any lingering trace of the man who had once made me feel beautiful and valued and essential. The fabric was soft against my skin, worn smooth by years of careful handling, but the scent I remembered was almost gone now. Just like everything else from the life I had once lived, it was fading away, becoming nothing more than a memory that fewer and fewer people shared with me. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about how I had arrived at this place. When had I become someone who could be dismissed so casually? When had my opinions stopped mattering? My feelings stopped counting? My very existence become something to be whispered about with disdain? The transformation had been so gradual that I had hardly noticed it happening, like the way you don't realize you're losing your sight until someone points out that you've been squinting to read things that used to be perfectly clear. But as I traced the timeline backward, I began to see the pattern. It had started small, with little comments about my cooking being too old-fashioned, my clothes being out of style, my opinions being outdated. Jessica had a gift for delivering these observations in a way that sounded helpful rather than hurtful, as if she was doing me a favor by pointing out my shortcomings. Eleanor, you really should try this new recipe I found. It's much more modern than that heavy casserole you always make. Or, that dress is so sweet, but don't you think something with a more contemporary cut would be more flattering? At first, I had tried to take her suggestions to heart, I bought new clothes with money I couldn't really afford to spend. I learned new recipes even though my old ones had been feeding this family successfully for decades. I bit my tongue when she rearranged my furniture and donated my belongings to charity without asking. I told myself that this was what families did. They grew and changed and adapted to each other's needs. I told myself that my discomfort was just a natural part of getting older, of learning to share space with the next generation. But the changes never seemed to satisfy Jessica. No matter how much I modified my behavior, how much I tried to conform to her vision of what I should be, it was never enough. The criticism continued, always delivered with that same helpful smile, always followed by the implication that I was being oversensitive if I took offense. "I'm only trying to help you, Eleanor. I know how hard it is to keep up with changing times." Meanwhile, Marcus seemed oblivious to the subtle war being waged in his own home. Or perhaps he wasn't oblivious at all. Perhaps he simply chose not to see what was happening because acknowledging it would have required him to take sides, and taking sides would have disrupted the comfortable life he had built with his wife. It was easier to assume that his mother was imagining slights where none existed, easier to believe that Jessica's intentions were pure and his mother was simply being difficult. I had been a single mother for most of Marcus's childhood after Robert died in that construction accident. When Marcus was only 15, I had worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads, cleaning office buildings at night and working at Goldstein's Deli during the day, slicing meat and making sandwiches for the lunch crowd that poured out of the nearby subway station. My hands had been permanently stained with the smell of pastrami and mustard, my back permanently curved from bending over mop buckets and industrial vacuum cleaners. But I had never complained, not once. Every blister on my feet, every ache in my joints, every sleepless night spent worrying about mortgage payments and electric bills had been worth it because I was building something for my son. I was giving him the foundation he needed to create a better life for himself, to escape the cycle of struggle and uncertainty that had defined my own existence. When he graduated from college, the first person in our family ever to do so, I had cried tears of pure joy and pride. And when he brought Jessica home during his senior year, I had been so happy to see him in love. She was beautiful and smart and ambitious, everything I wanted for my son in a partner. She came from a family with money, the kind of family where college was an expectation rather than a dream, where careers were planned rather than stumbled into out of necessity. I thought she would be good for Marcus, that she would help him reach heights I had never been able to imagine for him. What I hadn't anticipated was that Jessica would see me as an obstacle to the life she envisioned for herself and Marcus. In her world, elderly parents were carefully managed at arm's length, visited on holidays and special occasions, but never allowed to intrude on the daily business of successful young couples. The idea of a mother-in-law living in the same apartment, sharing the same space, being present for the intimate moments of marriage and parenthood, was apparently anathema to everything she believed about how modern families should function. But Marcus was all I had. After Robert died, I had poured all my energy into raising my son, leaving little time or opportunity for the friendships and outside interests that might have sustained me in my later years. My world had contracted to the size of our family unit, and when Marcus married Jessica, she became part of that unit whether I liked it or not. When they asked if they could move into my apartment to save money while Marcus established his accounting practice, I had said yes without hesitation. When they asked if I would help with childcare after Tyler was born, I had eagerly agreed. When they asked if I could contribute to household expenses now that there were more mouths to feed, I had gladly handed over a larger and larger portion of my modest income. But what I thought was an arrangement based on mutual support and family solidarity, Jessica apparently saw as a series of impositions and inconveniences. My presence in the apartment meant she couldn't decorate exactly as she pleased. My help with Tyler meant she had to share parenting decisions with someone whose methods she considered outdated. My financial contributions came with the unspoken expectation that I would continue to be welcomed and valued as a member of the household, an expectation that Jessica found increasingly burdensome as time went on. The morning after Tyler's birthday party, I woke up with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. The fog of confusion and self-doubt that had been clouding my judgment for so long seemed to have lifted overnight, and I could finally see my situation for what it really was. I wasn't a beloved family member who was graciously being allowed to age in place surrounded by loved ones. I was a tenant whose lease could be terminated at will, a babysitter whose services could be dispensed with when no longer needed, a financial resource whose value was measured purely in terms of what I could provide. The realization should have been devastating, but instead I felt something that surprised me, a spark of anger that I hadn't felt in decades. Not the petty irritation that comes from daily frustrations, but the deep, righteous anger that rises up when you finally understand that you've been taken advantage of by people who should have protected you. It was the same anger I had felt as a young woman when employers tried to pay me less than male workers doing the same job. The same anger that had fueled me through those exhausting years of single motherhood, when I refused to accept charity or pity from anyone. That anger was like a tiny flame in the darkness, and I found myself protecting it, nurturing it, allowing it to grow stronger. Because for the first time in years, I had something that felt like power, even if it was only the power to see my situation clearly and honestly. Jessica might be able to control many things about my life, but she couldn't control how I chose to interpret and respond to her treatment of me. I spent that day moving through my usual routine with new eyes. I noticed how Jessica flinched slightly when I entered the kitchen to make my morning coffee, as if my presence was a physical intrusion on her space. I noticed how she spoke to Tyler about plans for the upcoming weekend without including me, even though I had been his primary caregiver on weekends for years. I noticed how she answered her phone with a bright, cheerful voice, but let her expression go flat and cold the moment she saw me listening. But I also noticed things I had been too hurt and confused to see before. The way Tyler automatically looked to me when he skinned his knee, even though his mother was right there. The way he still asked for the bedtime stories I had been telling him since he was a toddler, the ones Jessica had never bothered to learn. The way he saved his drawings from school to show me first, before anyone else in the family had a chance to see them. And I noticed something else. Something that sent a chill down my spine when I finally allowed myself to acknowledge it. The stack of mail that had been accumulating on the hall table for weeks. Mail that Jessica always claimed to handle for me as a favor, hadn't actually been taken care of at all. Bills were going unpaid, appointment reminders were being ignored, and important documents from social services and Medicare were disappearing into the chaos of Jessica's version of household management. When I asked about it that evening, Jessica gave me the same bright smile she always used when she was about to deliver bad news in the most cheerful possible way. "Oh, Eleanor, don't worry about all that boring paperwork. I've been handling everything for you. You know how confusing all those government forms can be. I didn't want you to stress about it." But when I pressed for details, her explanations became vague and contradictory. She couldn't tell me which bills had been paid or when. She couldn't produce receipts or confirmation numbers. She couldn't even tell me where she had filed the documents, claiming that she had organized everything in a system that would be too complicated for me to understand. The more questions I asked, the more defensive she became, until finally she snapped at me with a tone I had never heard her use before. "Look, Eleanor, I'm doing the best I can here. Managing this household isn't easy, and I don't have time to give you a detailed accounting of every little thing. If you don't trust me to handle your affairs, maybe you should find someone else to do it." The threat was unmistakable. If I continued to question her methods, she would withdraw her help entirely, leaving me to navigate the labyrinth of paperwork and bureaucracy on my own. At my age, with my limited energy and growing confusion about technology and changing procedures, that prospect was genuinely frightening. So I backed down, apologized for being difficult, and retreated to my room feeling smaller and more powerless than ever. But that night, lying awake in the darkness, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to take back control of my own life, starting with my own mail. The next morning, while Jessica was out running errands and Marcus was at work, I called the post office and arranged to have my mail forwarded to a P.O. box I would rent under my own name. It was a small step, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it felt like the first real choice I had made for myself in years. Within a week of making that change, the full scope of Jessica's help became clear. Bills that I had assumed were being paid automatically had been accumulating late fees for months. My health insurance had lapsed because premium payments had been missed. Worst of all, there were several new credit card accounts in my name that I had never opened, accounts that had been used to make purchases I had never authorized. Someone had been using my identity to finance a lifestyle I couldn't afford, and the debt was mounting at an alarming rate. The discovery hit me like a physical blow. I sat on the floor of the post office, surrounded by pile after pile of overdue notices and collection letters, trying to understand how my financial life had spiraled so completely out of control without my knowledge. The numbers on the papers seemed to swim before my eyes as I tried to calculate just how much money had been stolen from me, how many months or years of my modest income would be required to pay back debts I had never consciously incurred. But worse than the financial betrayal was the emotional betrayal it represented. This wasn't just the careless mismanagement of someone who was overwhelmed and disorganized. This was deliberate fraud, carried out by someone who had gained my trust specifically for the purpose of exploiting it. Jessica hadn't been helping me manage my affairs out of kindness or family obligation. She had been systematically stealing from me, using my own confusion and dependency against me to cover her tracks. The walk home from the post office felt like the longest journey of my life. Every step carried the weight of a decision I wasn't sure I was brave enough to make. I could confront Jessica and Marcus about what I had discovered, demand accountability and restitution, and risk the explosion that would inevitably follow. Or I could continue to pretend ignorance, continue to play the role of the confused old woman who was grateful for whatever scraps of attention and care the family chose to throw her way. By the time I reached our building, I had made up my mind. I climbed the 4 flights of stairs to our apartment with more determination than I had felt in decades, my heart pounding not from exertion but from the anticipation of finally standing up for myself. The little flame of anger that had been burning in my chest for days now roared into a fire that warmed me from the inside out. I was done being a victim. I was done being taken advantage of. I was done smelling like the past while other people spent my future. But when I opened the apartment door and saw Jessica in the kitchen, casually making herself lunch with groceries I had paid for, the words died in my throat. She looked up at me with that same bright smile, the one I now recognized as a mask designed to hide her complete lack of genuine affection or respect for me. "Hi, Eleanor. How was your morning? I was just making a sandwich. Would you like me to make one for you too?" The offer of food, delivered in that cheerful tone, was so at odds with what I now knew about her true character that I almost laughed. Here was a woman who had been systematically robbing me for months, maybe years, and she was offering to make me a sandwich as if we were nothing more than roommates sharing a casual meal. The cognitive dissonance was so extreme that for a moment, I wondered if I was losing my mind, if the evidence I had seen with my own eyes was somehow a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a simple conversation. But then I remembered the tone of her voice when she had whispered, "She smells like the past," at Tyler's party. I remembered the casual cruelty of that moment, the way she had discussed me as if I were an unpleasant odor to be dealt with rather than a human being with feelings and dignity. And I knew that there was no misunderstanding here, no innocent explanation that would make any of this acceptable. "Jessica," I said, my voice steadier than I had expected it to be, "we need to talk." Something in my tone must have alerted her to the shift in our dynamic, because her smile flickered slightly around the edges. But she recovered quickly, setting down her sandwich and giving me her full attention with the kind of exaggerated concern people use when they're humoring someone they consider mentally unstable. "Of course, Eleanor. What's on your mind? You seem upset about something." I pulled out the stack of bills and collection notices I had been carrying in my purse, setting them down on the kitchen counter with deliberate care. The sound of paper hitting the formica surface was sharp and final, like a judge's gavel falling. "I want to know about these credit card accounts that were opened in my name. I want to know why my insurance has lapsed. I want to know where my money has been going for the past 2 years. For just a moment, Jessica's mask slipped completely. The helpful smile disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating that I had never seen on her face before. But then she caught herself, rearranging her features back into an expression of innocent confusion that might have fooled me just a few days earlier. "Eleanor, honey, I think there's been some kind of mix-up. You know how confused you get sometimes about these financial things. Why don't you sit down and let me explain everything?" The condescension in her voice, the way she called me honey as if I were a child, the suggestion that I was confused rather than informed, ignited something in me that I hadn't felt since I was a young woman fighting for every scrap of respect and recognition in a world that wanted to dismiss me. I pulled myself up to my full height, all 5 feet 2 inches of me, and looked Jessica directly in the eyes. "I am not confused," I said, each word crisp and clear. "I am not stupid. And I am not going to stand here and let you gaslight me about my own financial records. Someone has been using my credit to make purchases I never authorized, and someone has been intercepting my mail to hide the evidence. Since you're the only person who has had access to my personal information, I think we both know who that someone is." The silence that followed felt like it stretched for hours, although it probably lasted no more than a few seconds. Jessica stared at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language, as if the idea that I might actually be capable of independent thought and investigation was completely beyond her comprehension. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost all pretense of warmth or concern. "You don't know what you're talking about, Eleanor. You're an old woman who can barely remember what she had for breakfast, let alone manage complex financial arrangements. If there are problems with your accounts, it's probably because you forgot about purchases you made yourself, or because you gave your information to some telemarketer who took advantage of you." The accusation hung in the air between us like a poisonous cloud. She was trying to make me doubt my own sanity, to convince me that I was the problem rather than the victim. It was a tactic I recognized from my younger days, when men would try to dismiss my complaints about workplace harassment by suggesting that I was being overly sensitive or misinterpreting innocent behavior. The same psychological weapons that had been used against me decades ago were being deployed by my own daughter-in-law in my own kitchen. But I was not the same frightened young woman who had once allowed herself to be silenced by such tactics. I was a survivor who had raised a child alone, who had worked multiple jobs for decades, who had navigated the complexities of widowhood and aging without losing my essential dignity. I had been temporarily weakened by grief and loneliness, but I had not been destroyed. And I was not going to let Jessica's manipulation tactics work on me now. "Show me the receipts," I said simply. "If I made these purchases, there will be receipts. If I authorize these accounts, there will be applications with my signature. Show me the paperwork, Jessica, or admit what you've done." Something shifted in Jessica's expression then, a subtle hardening that told me she had finally realized her psychological games weren't going to work. The mask of helpful concern had been completely abandoned now, replaced by the kind of cold irritation someone might show toward a persistent insect that refused to be swatted away. When she spoke again, her voice was flat and businesslike, devoid of any warmth or familial affection. "Fine. You want to know the truth? The truth is that this family has been supporting you for years while you contribute practically nothing to the household expenses. Marcus and I work our asses off to pay for this apartment, to buy food, to cover utilities, to provide for Tyler's needs. All you do is sit around feeling sorry for yourself and expecting us to take care of you like some kind of charity case." She was warming up now, years of suppressed resentment flowing out in a torrent of accusations and justifications. "You think your little social security check covers your fair share of living here? You think the few dollars you contribute for groceries makes you an equal partner in this household? We've been subsidizing your existence for a decade, Eleanor, and frankly, we're tired of it. If I used your credit to buy things for this family, things that benefit everyone, including you, then maybe you should consider it a form of back payment for all the support you've been receiving." The logic was so twisted, so completely divorced from reality, that for a moment I was speechless. According to Jessica's version of events, I was somehow indebted to them for the privilege of being emotionally abused and financially exploited. My contributions to the household, both financial and in terms of childcare and domestic labor, had been mysteriously erased from the narrative, replaced by a story in which I was nothing more than a parasite feeding off their generosity. But what struck me most wasn't the unfairness of her accusations. It was the revelation that this was how she had always seen me from the very beginning of our relationship. All those years when I thought I was being welcomed into an expanded family unit, she had been keeping a mental ledger of every penny she imagined I owed them. All those times when I had tried to be helpful and supportive, she had been cataloging my contributions as inadequate and my presence as burdensome. "You're right about one thing," I said, surprising her by agreeing with part of her statement. "I have been contributing to this household for years. I've been paying rent, buying groceries, covering utilities, and providing free childcare. But apparently that's not enough for you. Apparently, in your mind, those contributions give you the right to steal from me." I picked up the stack of bills from the counter and held them out toward her like evidence in a court case. "These aren't household expenses, Jessica. These are charges for clothes and cosmetics and restaurant meals, purchases made with credit cards I never applied for. This isn't you trying to cover legitimate family costs. This is you using my identity to finance your personal lifestyle. And that's not a family obligation or a misunderstanding. That's fraud." The word fraud seemed to hit Jessica like a physical blow. For the first time since the conversation had started, she looked genuinely worried, rather than just annoyed. The legal implications of what she had been doing must have finally occurred to her. The possibility that this situation could escalate beyond a family argument into something with real consequences. "You can't prove any of that," she said, but there was less conviction in her voice now. "And even if you could, what are you going to do about it? Call the police on your own family? Take your son's wife to court? Destroy Tyler's home just because you're angry about some credit card bills?" There it was, the final card in Jessica's hand, the threat that had been keeping me compliant and silent for years. If I fought back, if I demanded accountability, if I refused to accept being abused, then I would be the one responsible for destroying the family. Tyler would be the one who suffered. Marcus would be forced to choose between his wife and his mother, and we all knew which choice he would make. It was emotional blackmail of the most sophisticated kind, designed to exploit the very love and loyalty that made me vulnerable to exploitation in the first place. Jessica knew that I would endure almost any level of personal suffering, rather than risk Tyler's stability or happiness. She knew that my fear of being completely cut off from my family was stronger than my desire for justice or dignity, and she was betting that this knowledge would be enough to keep me quiet for whatever time I had left. For a long moment, I stood there in that kitchen considering my options. I could back down, apologize for making accusations, and return to the familiar routine of being grateful for whatever scraps of affection and inclusion the family chose to throw my way. I could pretend that this conversation had never happened, pretend that I hadn't discovered the extent of the betrayal, pretend that everything was fine as long as everyone else was comfortable. Or I could choose a different path, one that would require more courage than I was sure I possessed. I could decide that my dignity and self-respect were worth fighting for, even if that fight came with a price I wasn't sure I was prepared to pay. I could decide that being alone with integrity was better than being included in a family that saw me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. The decision, when it came, surprised me with its clarity. Maybe it was the memory of Robert's voice telling me I was stronger than I knew. Maybe it was thinking about Tyler and what kind of lesson I wanted him to learn about how families treat their most vulnerable members. Or maybe it was simply that I had reached the limit of what one human being could be expected to endure in silence. "You're right," I told Jessica, my voice calm and steady. "I can't force you to admit what you've done. I can't make Marcus see what's been happening in his own home. And I can't guarantee that fighting back won't have consequences for everyone in this family." I paused, letting those words sink in, watching as relief began to creep across Jessica's features. She thought she had won, thought she had successfully intimidated me back into compliance. But then I continued, and the relief vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "But what I can do is remove myself from this situation entirely. I can move out of this apartment, close the joint account you've been using, change my address with all the relevant agencies, and file a police report about the identity theft. I can make sure that whatever happens next, you won't be able to continue stealing from me or using my presence as an excuse for your behavior." The color drained from Jessica's face as the implications of what I was saying hit her. Without my financial contributions, the family's comfortable lifestyle would become much more difficult to maintain. Without my free childcare, she would need to find alternative arrangements that would cost money they didn't have. Without my willingness to be a scapegoat for all the family's problems, she would need to find other explanations for the tensions and difficulties in her marriage. But more than that, my departure would represent a narrative she couldn't control. If I left quietly, people would ask questions. Friends and neighbors and Tyler's teachers would wonder what had happened to the grandmother who had been such a constant presence in the child's life. Jessica would need to explain my absence without admitting her role in driving me away, and that explanation would need to be convincing enough to avoid scrutiny. "You can't just leave," Jessica said, and for the first time I heard something like panic in her voice. "What about Tyler? What about Marcus? This is your family, Eleanor. You can't just walk away from your own family over some misunderstanding about money." But I was already walking away, both literally and figuratively. I gathered up the bills from the counter and headed toward my room, leaving Jessica standing alone in the kitchen with her half-eaten sandwich and her suddenly precarious kingdom. As I closed my bedroom door behind me, I heard her calling after me, her voice growing shriller and more desperate with each word. "Eleanor, Eleanor, come back here. We need to work this out. You can't just run away from your problems." But they weren't my problems anymore. For the first time in years, I was making a choice based on what was best for me, rather than what was most convenient for everyone else. It felt terrifying and exhilarating at the same time, like stepping off the edge of a cliff and discovering that I could fly. That afternoon, while Jessica was gone and before Marcus returned from work, I began the process of reclaiming my independence. I called a locksmith and had the locks changed on the storage unit where I kept my most important documents and possessions, things Jessica had been pressuring me to get rid of for years, claiming they were cluttering up the apartment. I called my bank and closed all joint accounts, opening new ones that only I could access. I called the credit card companies and filed fraud reports for all the accounts that had been opened without my authorization. Each phone call felt like a small victory, a reclamation of power that had been taken from me so gradually, I hadn't realized it was gone until I felt it returning. The customer service representatives I spoke with were kind and professional, treating me as a competent adult capable of managing her own affairs, rather than as a confused elderly woman who needed constant supervision. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to me with that kind of basic respect that I found myself close to tears more than once during these conversations. By the time Marcus came home from work that evening, I had made significant progress toward disentangling my life from the web of dependency and control that had trapped me for so long. I heard him talking to Jessica in hushed, urgent tones in their bedroom, no doubt getting her version of the day's events. I could imagine how she would frame the story. Poor, confused Eleanor having some kind of mental health crisis, imagining problems where none existed, threatening to destroy the family over imaginary grievances. When Marcus finally knocked on my door, his face was a mixture of concern, confusion, and barely suppressed irritation. He looked like a man who had come home from a stressful day at work expecting to relax with his family, only to find his household in chaos over issues he couldn't understand and didn't want to deal with. "Mom," he said, settling heavily into the chair beside my bed. "Jessica told me you've been having some kind of problem with your finances. She said you accused her of stealing from you, which is obviously ridiculous. Are you feeling okay? Maybe we should make an appointment with your doctor, just to make sure everything's all right with your medication." There it was. The suggestion that my complaints were symptoms of mental illness, rather than legitimate grievances. It was Jessica's final strategy, and unfortunately, it was one that Marcus seemed all too willing to embrace. It would be so much easier for him to believe that his mother was becoming senile than to confront the possibility that his wife had been systematically abusing the elderly woman under their roof. But I was prepared for this conversation in a way that I hadn't been prepared for my confrontation with Jessica. I had spent the afternoon collecting documentation, organizing evidence, and preparing a clear, rational explanation of what had been happening. I spread the papers out on my bedspread like a lawyer presenting a case to a jury. "Marcus," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "I want you to look at these documents carefully. These are credit card statements for accounts I never opened, showing purchases I never made. These are bills that should have been paid months ago, bills that Jessica claimed she was handling for me. These are late fees and collection notices for debts I didn't know existed." I watched his face as he examined the papers, saw the moment when the reality of what he was seeing began to penetrate the wall of denial he had built around his wife's behavior. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Pages and pages of financial records that painted a clear picture of systematic fraud and neglect. "But why would Jessica?" he started to say, then trailed off as the implications hit him. If Jessica had been stealing from me, then she had also been lying to him. If she was capable of this level of deception and manipulation, then what else might she be capable of? What else might he have been blind to in his own marriage? "I don't know why," I told him honestly. Maybe she convinced herself that she deserved the money somehow. Maybe she thought I wouldn't live long enough for anyone to notice. Maybe she just got used to seeing me as something less than human, something that existed for her convenience rather than a person with rights and dignity. Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring at the papers in his hands as if they might change or disappear if he looked at them long enough. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and defeated. "What do you want me to do, Mom? I can't just throw my wife out. I can't break up Tyler's home. If Jessica made some kind of mistake with your finances, I'm sure we can work it out somehow. Maybe we can set up a payment plan or—" "No," I interrupted, surprising both of us with the firmness of my response. "This isn't a mistake that can be fixed with a payment plan. This is a pattern of abuse that's been going on for years. Jessica doesn't respect me, Marcus. She doesn't see me as a member of this family. And I'm not going to keep pretending that's acceptable just because it's easier for everyone else." I could see the conflict playing out on his face. Love for his mother warring with loyalty to his wife, desire to do the right thing competing with fear of the consequences. He was a good man at heart, but he was also a man who had spent years choosing the path of least resistance, avoiding conflict by pretending problems didn't exist. "So what are you saying?" he asked. "You want to press charges? You want to take this to court? You want to destroy our family over money?" It was the same argument Jessica had made, the same emotional blackmail disguised as concern for family unity. But coming from Marcus, it hurt more than I had expected. This was my son, the child I had sacrificed everything to raise and educate and launch into the world. And when forced to choose between protecting me and protecting his wife, he was choosing his wife. "I'm not destroying anything," I said quietly. "I'm removing myself from a situation where I'm not wanted or valued. I'm too old to spend whatever time I have left being treated like a burden by people who should love me." The next few days passed in a haze of practical arrangements and emotional confrontations. I rented a small apartment in Queens, not far from where I had lived with Robert during our early married years. It was tiny but clean, with a window that looked out onto a courtyard where children played and neighbors hung their laundry to dry. It felt like a place where I could start over, where the smell of the past might be replaced by the possibility of a different kind of future. Jessica oscillated between fury and false sweetness, sometimes screaming at me about my ingratitude and selfishness, sometimes trying to convince me that I was making a terrible mistake by leaving the family. Marcus withdrew into himself, speaking to me only when necessary, and then in the kind of polite, distant tone you might use with a stranger. Tyler seemed confused by the tension in the household, but was too young to understand what was really happening. The night before I moved out, Tyler knocked on my bedroom door and asked if he could come in. I was packing the last of my belongings, mostly books and photographs and a few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to my mother, and he sat on the edge of my bed watching me fold clothes into boxes. "Grandma," he said in that serious way children have when they're trying to understand something beyond their years. "Are you moving out because we were mean to you?" The question broke my heart and filled me with hope at the same time. Tyler, at least, had been paying attention. Tyler had noticed that something was wrong with the way I was being treated. Tyler still saw me as a person whose feelings mattered. "I'm moving out because I need to take care of myself," I told him, choosing my words carefully. Sometimes adults need to make changes in their lives to be happy and healthy. It doesn't mean I don't love you. It doesn't mean I won't still be your grandmother. It just means I need to live in a place where I can be myself. He nodded as if this made perfect sense to him, which maybe it did. Children have a clarity about fairness and kindness that adults often lose as they get older and more willing to accept compromises and excuses. Tyler knew that I had been sad and worried, even if he didn't understand all the reasons why. "Will you still tell me stories?" he asked, and I promised him that I would. "Will you still make me pancakes?" he asked, and I promised him that too whenever he came to visit me in my new home. When Tyler left that night, he hugged me tighter and longer than he had in months. It felt like a benediction, a blessing on the journey I was about to undertake. Even if I lost everyone else in this family, I hadn't lost the love of my grandson. That connection, that pure and uncomplicated affection, would survive whatever changes were coming. The actual move took less than a day. I didn't have much to take with me. Years of living in Jessica's domain had taught me to keep my possessions to a minimum, to avoid accumulating anything that might be criticized as clutter or outdated sentiment. But what I did have felt precious in a way that material possessions hadn't felt for years. These were things I had chosen for myself, things that reflected my own taste and history, rather than someone else's vision of how I should live. My new apartment felt enormous after the cramped bedroom I had been occupying for so long. I had space to spread out, to arrange my furniture the way I wanted it, to display my photographs without worrying about whether they matched someone else's decorating scheme. For the first time in years, I could cook what I wanted to eat, watch what I wanted to watch on television, go to bed and wake up according to my own schedule rather than the rhythms of a household that had never quite made room for me. The silence was the strangest thing. After years of living in an apartment where I was always listening for footsteps in the hallway, voices in other rooms, the subtle cues that would tell me whether I was welcome in common areas or should stay hidden in my room, the complete quiet of my own space felt almost alien. But gradually, I began to appreciate it. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of possibilities, full of choices that were entirely my own to make. But even as I was learning to enjoy my newfound independence, Jessica wasn't finished with her campaign of psychological warfare. She began calling me multiple times a day, sometimes crying about how much Tyler missed me, sometimes raging about the financial difficulties my departure had created for the family. She sent me text messages at all hours, guilt-inducing missives designed to convince me that I was a selfish old woman who was punishing innocent people for imaginary slights. The messages were a masterclass in emotional manipulation. "Tyler keeps asking when you're coming home," she would write. "He cries every night and I don't know what to tell him." Or, "Marcus is working double shifts now to cover the expenses you used to help with. I hope you're happy knowing that your own son is suffering because of your stubbornness." For a while, these messages had the desired effect. I would lie awake at night consumed with guilt and doubt, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake by choosing my own well-being over family harmony. Maybe I was being selfish. Maybe I should have tried harder to work things out. Maybe the problems in our relationship were as much my fault as Jessica's, and leaving had been an act of cowardice rather than courage. But then one afternoon, as I was sitting in a coffee shop in my new neighborhood, reading one of Jessica's latest guilt-inducing texts, I overheard a conversation at the next table that changed my perspective entirely. Two women about my daughter-in-law's age were discussing a difficult situation with one of their elderly relatives. "She's driving us all crazy," one of them was saying. "She's so needy and demanding, always wanting attention, always complaining about something. We've tried to be patient, but honestly, sometimes I just want to tell her to get over herself and be grateful for what she has." "I know exactly what you mean," her friend replied. "My grandmother was like that toward the end. Everything was a drama. Everything was someone else's fault. It's like they forget that other people have lives too, that the world doesn't revolve around their problems." Listening to this conversation, I realized something that should have been obvious, but had been hidden from me by years of conditioning and gaslighting. I wasn't the only elderly person being treated this way. I wasn't uniquely difficult or demanding or ungrateful. What I was experiencing was part of a larger pattern, a cultural attitude toward aging that saw older people as burdens rather than human beings, problems to be managed rather than family members to be cherished. Jessica's behavior toward me wasn't personal, even though it felt deeply personal. It was systemic. She had been socialized to see elderly people, and elderly women in particular, as something less than fully human. My needs didn't matter because old people's needs were inherently unreasonable. My feelings didn't count because old people's feelings were inherently invalid. My perspective was dismissed because old people's perspectives were inherently outdated and irrelevant. Understanding this didn't make Jessica's treatment of me any less painful, but it did help me stop blaming myself for it. I wasn't being abused because I was a bad person or a difficult mother-in-law. I was being abused because I was vulnerable, and because the person abusing me had learned that vulnerable elderly people were acceptable targets for exploitation and cruelty. This realization gave me the strength to do something I should have done weeks earlier. I blocked Jessica's number on my phone and changed my email address. I refused to engage with her manipulation tactics, or allow her to continue colonizing my emotional space with her manufactured crises and false emergencies. If she wanted to communicate with me, she could do so through Marcus. If Marcus wanted to maintain a relationship with his mother, he could do so without allowing his wife to use him as a conduit for her psychological abuse. The immediate result was a blissful return of peace and quiet to my daily life. No more phones ringing at inappropriate hours. No more text messages designed to make me feel guilty for protecting myself. No more emotional ambushes that left me questioning my own sanity and moral compass. I could finally begin to heal from the trauma of the past few years, to rebuild my sense of self-worth without constantly having it undermined by someone who had never cared about my well-being. But the broader result was even more significant. For the first time since Robert's death, I began to remember who I was outside of my roles as mother, grandmother, and source of financial support. I was a woman with interests and opinions and preferences that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs or expectations. I could read books that no one else would approve of, watch movies that no one else wanted to see, cook foods that no one else was required to eat. I could be eccentric or conventional, social or solitary, energetic or lazy, entirely according to my own desires rather than someone else's agenda. The person who emerged from this process of rediscovery was someone I hadn't seen in decades. She was tougher than I remembered, more resilient, more willing to fight for what she believed in. She had opinions about things that mattered and wasn't afraid to express them. She had preferences that didn't need to be justified to anyone. She had boundaries that didn't need to be apologized for or explained away. This woman was also capable of forming new relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation or dependency. I joined a book club at the local library and discovered that I had things to contribute to discussions about literature and ideas. I volunteered at a community garden and found that my knowledge of plants and growing things was valued by people who saw me as competent rather than confused. I started taking a watercolor class at the community center and learned that I had artistic abilities I had never had time to develop when my life was consumed by other people's needs. But perhaps most importantly, I began to understand that the love I felt for Tyler didn't require me to tolerate abuse from his parents. If anything, protecting myself from that abuse made me a better grandmother, because it allowed me to be present with him in a way that wasn't tainted by resentment or suppressed anger. When we spent time together, which we did regularly, despite Jessica's attempts to limit our contact, I could focus entirely on him rather than on managing my own emotional wounds. Tyler, for his part, seemed to understand and respect the changes in our relationship. He never asked uncomfortable questions about why I had moved out or why there was tension between his parents and me. He simply accepted that Grandma now lived in a different place, a place where he was always welcome and where the rules were different from those at home. At my apartment, he could be as loud or quiet as he wanted. He could help cook meals without being told he was making a mess. He could ask as many questions as he wanted without being hushed or redirected. In short, he could be a child in the way that children need to be children, without constant adult management and control. The contrast between Tyler's behavior at my apartment and his behavior at home was striking. At home, he was often anxious and subdued, walking on eggshells around his mother's moods and expectations. At my place, he was relaxed and animated, full of stories and jokes and silly observations about the world around him. It broke my heart to see how much stress he was carrying for such a young child, how much emotional labor he was already doing to maintain peace in his household. But it also gave me hope. Tyler was learning that there were different ways to live, different approaches to relationships, different standards for how people should treat each other. Even if he couldn't articulate it yet, he was absorbing lessons about respect and kindness and unconditional love that would serve him well as he grew older. Maybe someday, when he was an adult with his own family, he would remember his grandmother not as someone who had caused problems by standing up for herself, but as someone who had taught him that people deserve to be treated with dignity regardless of their age or vulnerability. 6 months after I moved out, Marcus called to tell me that he and Jessica were getting divorced. The conversation was awkward and brief. He didn't provide details about what had finally opened his eyes to his wife's character, and I didn't ask. But he did say something that meant more to me than all the apologies in the world. "I should have listened to you, Mom. I should have protected you better." It wasn't a complete reconciliation. Too much had happened, too much trust had been broken, for us to simply return to the relationship we had once shared. But it was a beginning, an acknowledgement that the problems in our family weren't entirely my fault, a recognition that I had legitimate grievances that deserved to be heard and addressed. More importantly, it meant that Tyler's living situation would change in ways that might give him more stability and peace. Marcus had always been the gentler parent, more patient and understanding, less concerned with controlling every aspect of his son's behavior and environment. With Jessica out of the picture, Tyler would have more freedom to be himself, more space to develop his own interests and opinions without constant criticism and correction. The divorce proceedings were messy and complicated, involving custody battles and financial disputes that occasionally required my testimony about Jessica's history of fraud and manipulation. It was painful to air our family's private business in court, to see Tyler caught in the middle of adult conflicts he shouldn't have had to witness. But it was also validating to have an objective third party, the judge, acknowledge that Jessica's behavior had been inappropriate and harmful. In the end, Marcus was awarded primary custody of Tyler, with Jessica receiving supervised visitation rights that reflected the court's concerns about her mental stability and history of financial crimes. She was also ordered to pay restitution for the money she had stolen from me, though I wasn't holding my breath about actually receiving those payments. The money had never been the point anyway. The point had been establishing a public record that what she had done to me was wrong, that elderly people have rights that must be respected, that family relationships don't give anyone license to commit fraud or abuse. The day the divorce was finalized, Tyler came to stay with me for a week while Marcus figured out new childcare arrangements and settled into his role as a single father. It was the longest period we had spent together since I had moved out, and it gave us both a chance to adjust to the new dynamics of our relationship. Tyler was quieter than usual at first, processing the reality that his parents' marriage was over, that his family structure was changing in ways he couldn't control. But as the days passed, I watched him begin to relax in ways I hadn't seen since he was a very small child. Without Jessica's constant presence and criticism, he became more spontaneous, more curious, more willing to express opinions that might not meet with adult approval. We spent those days doing simple things together, cooking pancakes for breakfast, reading stories, working puzzles, taking long walks through the neighborhood. But there was a quality of freedom to these activities that had been missing from our interactions when we lived in the same apartment. Tyler knew that I wasn't going anywhere, that our time together wasn't dependent on someone else's mood or schedule, that he could count on me to be consistently present and engaged without trying to manage or control his experience. On the last night of that week, as I was tucking him into the sofa bed I had set up in my living room, Tyler said something that brought tears to my eyes. "Grandma," he said, "I like it better when you live in your own place. You seem happier here." Out of the mouths of babes. This 8-year-old child had noticed something that had taken me years to understand, that I was indeed happier living independently, that the stress and anxiety I had carried for so long had lifted when I removed myself from a toxic environment. Tyler had given me the greatest gift possible, the recognition that my decision to prioritize my own well-being hadn't been selfish or destructive, but healthy and necessary. As I write this now, 2 years after that conversation with Jessica in the kitchen, I can honestly say that leaving that apartment was the best decision I made in the second half of my life. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the loneliness felt overwhelming, days when I questioned whether I had the strength to build a completely new life at my age. But the alternative? Continuing to accept abuse and exploitation in exchange for the illusion of family connection would have been worse than loneliness. It would have been a betrayal of everything I had learned about my own worth and dignity over 7 decades of living. My life now is smaller in some ways than it was when I was embedded in Marcus and Jessica's household. I have less money, since I'm no longer contributing to a shared budget and benefiting from economies of scale. I have fewer people around me on a daily basis, since I no longer live in the middle of a busy family's comings and goings. I have less certainty about who will take care of me if I become seriously ill or disabled, since I can't count on family members who see me as an obligation rather than a beloved relative. But my life is also larger in ways that matter more than money or convenience or security. I have more autonomy, more dignity, more opportunities to make choices based on my own preferences rather than other people's expectations. I have relationships that are based on mutual affection and respect rather than duty and guilt. I have time and energy to pursue interests I had forgotten I possessed, to develop aspects of my personality that had been suppressed by years of trying to make myself as small and unobtrusive as possible. Most importantly, I have Tyler's respect and love in a way that I never had when I was allowing his mother to treat me badly. Children learn how to treat people by watching how the adults around them behave. If I had continued to accept Jessica's abuse, I would have been teaching Tyler that elderly people don't deserve consideration, that family members can be cruel to each other without consequences, that weakness invites exploitation. By standing up for myself, I taught him that every person has inherent worth, that love doesn't require accepting mistreatment, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is establish boundaries that protect your own well-being. Tyler is 10 now, and our relationship continues to evolve as he grows older and more capable of understanding the complexities of adult relationships. He knows that his parents' divorce was partly the result of his mother's treatment of me, though I've been careful never to speak badly about Jessica in his presence. He knows that I chose to live independently because I needed to take care of myself, not because I stopped loving him or his father. He knows that families come in many different forms, and that sometimes the healthiest configuration isn't the one that looks most traditional from the outside. What Tyler doesn't know yet, but will understand someday when he's older, is that his grandmother's decision to leave an abusive situation was an act of love. Love for herself, love for him, and love for the principle that human dignity is worth fighting for regardless of age or circumstances. I hope that lesson will stay with him all his life, that it will influence how he treats elderly people in his own family and community, that it will give him the courage to stand up for himself and others when standing up is difficult but necessary. For those of you listening to this story who recognize aspects of your own experience in what I've shared, I want you to know that you are not alone. Elder abuse is more common than most people realize, and it takes many forms. Financial exploitation, emotional manipulation, physical neglect, social isolation, and the systematic erosion of dignity and autonomy that can make older people feel worthless and invisible. If you are experiencing this kind of treatment, please know that age doesn't disqualify you from respect and kindness. Your needs matter. Your feelings are valid. Your perspective has value. You deserve to be treated with the same consideration that would be extended to any other adult, regardless of how dependent you might be on family members for various forms of support. Change is possible at any age. Independence is possible at any age. The discovery or rediscovery of joy and purpose and meaningful relationships is possible at any age. It may require more courage and determination than you think you possess, but the alternative, accepting abuse and exploitation as the price of family connection, is no way to spend whatever time you have left on this earth. You are worth fighting for. Your dignity is worth protecting. Your happiness matters, not just to you, but to the younger generations who are watching and learning from your example. Sometimes the most important thing an older person can do is refuse to be invisible, refuse to accept dismissive treatment, refuse to apologize for taking up space in the world. The smell of the past isn't something to be ashamed of. It's the evidence of a life fully lived, of experiences accumulated, of wisdom earned through surviving whatever challenges have come your way. Let that scent be one of strength rather than defeat, of resilience rather than resignation, of dignity rather than despair. Have you ever experienced something similar to what I went through with Jessica and Marcus? Have you found yourself wondering if you're being too sensitive, too demanding, too much trouble for the people who claim to love you? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience matters, and someone else might find hope and courage in knowing they're not alone. If this story touched your heart or opened your eyes to something you hadn't considered before, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps ensure that stories like mine reach the people who need to hear them most. The people who are sitting in their small rooms right now wondering if they have the strength to choose dignity over false peace. Remember, you are never too old to start over. You are never too old to demand better. You are never too old to choose yourself.